Well, and I can honestly say I heard a rumor that if you haven't yet done so, November is an exceptional time to get your flu shot. Really good time, very easy to get. A lot of places do it. Most of them bill your insurance. You don't even have to take money out of your pocket. It is so cool. So now what we want to do is we want to take a little bit of time to update you on some work that we're doing as a coalition and a community in Spokane, as we have, as you know, we've brought to you on a few occasions our role and our processes around disaster medical coordination, where if we were to have an MCI event, a mass casualty event in our region, how are we going to manage distribution of patients around the hospitals and the healthcare systems so that they receive the appropriate care at the appropriate facility in an appropriate amount of time, with the ultimate goal of reducing secondary transfers. So we've done a lot of work on that over the last couple of years, and we developed a plan, we put it in place, and as you're going to hear, we've had some experiences that have found some gaps in some areas of improvement that we're trying to work on. So we want to bring some of that work to you. And Jay Atwood from the Combined Communications Center here in Spokane is with the Spokane Fire Department, and he's going to provide some insight into some of that work.
Yeah, this one's fine. Thanks, Ed. So Travis and Ed both asked me to come out and kind of talk about what it is that we're doing to kind of improve the process or improve the system. Because one of the biggest things that we found was that in activating the DMCC, or the Disaster Medical Control or Coordination Center, there's a lag in time between when we identify there's an event with mass casualty folks that could flood the emergency departments for the local hospitals, getting them ramped up to be able to deal with that influx of patients, et cetera. So it was identified through some different things that have occurred recently in the last couple of years that maybe, hey, the Combined Communications Center, from the standpoint of Spokane County, might be in a position where we can start doing some triage work, I guess, and distribution of patient load ahead of time while Deaconess, as the main coordination center, ramps up their ability to deal with those patients. So some of the things, just kind of wanted to give a brief overview of what disaster medical control is for those that aren't aware of what that function looks like. Talk about some of the events that have occurred recently, 2015, and a couple that have happened in this last year during 2016. Go over our proposed plan, look at kind of how it works overall, so to speak, and then what are we going to do taking steps forward to initiate this plan and looking at growing it out past Spokane County in the future. So as I pointed out, Deaconess is the current disaster medical control hospital or coordination center. They've been in the lead position, if you will, from 1982 to 2013. Basically, there's just an identification, especially when you look historically over some of the big events we've had in the past 20 to 30 years, some things that have generated a huge influx of patients that would flood the emergency departments for the hospitals in Spokane. So how do we get a handle on that so we don't end up with 30 patients showing up at one ED and overwhelming that hospital? So the concept of the disaster medical control came up. Deaconess ended up the hub. I'm not sure the historical reason why Deaconess was picked, but since I've been involved in the fire service, Deaconess has always been the DMCC. In 2013, through, I guess I would say, a collaborative effort between East Region EMS and Healthcare Coalition and public health partners, I guess the distribution of the workload kind of evolved, and Deaconess is still the main hub, if you will, for disaster medical control, but we have a big region involving several counties. So Holy Family is now in the mix, and their main objective is to provide DMCC services for the northeast part of the state, and then Pullman Regional, they're handling the southeast part of the state as it relates to our region for disaster medical control services. So the Disaster Medical Control Center, their main thing is to place patients at the appropriate facilities that can provide the best level of care for those patients in a timely fashion. The one thing that we don't want to have happen is have patients go somewhere, end up not being able to be treated effectively, and then have to be transferred again somewhere else. So the whole idea here is for Deaconess to coordinate that effort and hopefully get the patient from point A to point B one time and have them receive the most effective treatment. As I pointed out, we're divided now into 3 subregions based on that pictorial that I had shown previously. If Deaconess as the main medical control center, for some reason they're incapable of providing that service, then it will default to Holy Family. So we do have a backup main DMCC, if you will. So some of the events that have occurred within the last couple of years that really kind of help identify some gaps or leg, if you will, in how the process works. We had the Zodiac aircraft plant explosion. It occurred in Newport, Washington back in July of 2015. And I don't remember the patient count exactly. I know that Spokane Fire got involved. We sent our hazmat team up there. And as a result of that, we had a fairly significant number of patients that were transported from that incident. We had the Pacific, a lot of folks probably remember the Pacific Steel and Recycling hazmat incident where the cylinder of ammonia was accidentally crushed and burst, and we had, I couldn't tell you the number. A lot of EDs were flooded, we'll just say that. We had walk-ins, we had transports, et cetera. We did end up with 1 fatality as a result of that incident, but it created a burden on the system, to say the least. In 16, there was an exercise conducted, DMCC full-scale exercise that was conducted, and unfortunately, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I didn't participate in that, so I don't have a lot of details, and I don't know if, Ed, you want to kind of fill in some of the blanks on that.
Yeah, I can throw in some, that actually was not a full-scale exercise. It was a Spokane International Airport exercise that they're mandated to do every year. So they had to do a mass fatality exercise with and the exercise was a plane crash. I guess it was more of a function. Well, I guess for them it was full scale. Yeah, now that I think about it, yeah, they were doing the whole thing. I take that all back as I look at the bigger picture. That event actually incorporated the DMCC, Deaconess serving the role of patient placement. So we had the transport officer at the airport contacting Deaconess to say, I have this many patients. Where do I distribute them? The DMCC would assess the hospitals, the healthcare system, and then they would distribute those patients according to patient care needs. And it was a pretty successful exercise. The DMCC role was really, I think, really appreciated about what takes place in that role during an event. But at the same time, along with these other events, we identified some needs and some gaps. After the now agreed upon full-scale exercise that Ed just talked about, we ended up having another event out on the West Plains, here on the West Plains, Fairchild Air Force Base. They ended up having a hazmat situation where they had, I believe it ended up being some sort of air freshener product that released, and we had several patients transported as a result of that. And I think it was in that event where we really discovered some efficiencies in direct coordination with fire resources, boots on the ground, if you will, and the disaster medical control facility in order to handle the logistics of patient movement. Again, this is just another depiction of what the flow chart looks like, if you will, for activation of a disaster medical control. Each of the hospitals and their the counties that they're responsible for as it relates to disaster medical control distribution. Some of the trigger points, this is actually the procedure, I guess, for lack of a better term, that we follow in the healthcare arena as it relates to MCI and utilizing DMCC. Some of the trigger points that result in a mass casualty event, it seems common sense, but we thought, in some cases, some events aren't always identified as an MCI, so it's important to put some definition around what that could be. And the main reason being, going back to what I was mentioning earlier about notification, the system gets behind really quickly when you have an influx of patients. So we identified that pretty much anything that would result in 5 patients or more,
that would be considered an MCI, and what are some of the things that could cause that. Multiple ambulances dispatched to one incident, and that could be anything, multi-car, motor vehicle accident, or any sort of a hazardous material release, etc. Structure fires are one of the big ones that have come up recently as well. We've realized that, especially when you look at a facility with multiple occupants, that could easily result in several casualties, and that would constitute an MCI, and you could get behind the curve fairly quickly there. Any sort of public event, so we have several, especially in Spokane, Bloomsday, Hoop Fest, etc. Any of the big sporting events now, with especially GU gaining popularity, there's a ton of people crammed into that facility, so there's a lot of potential with all of those. We have lots of air traffic between Fairchild and SIA and Felts Field. And of course, anything that involves, unfortunately, terrorist acts. We've encountered a lot of that historically in the last few years around the country, and have had a couple of legitimate threats here locally as well. So any of those things could be an actual trigger. And from our perspective, we've always tried to operate under the premise that even if we don't have casualties, if we think there's that potential, we should probably activate the DMCC and get them rolling. So this is a good idea, a good visual depiction of what an MCI looks like, and this occurred in Seattle not too long ago. This was the duck boat tour bus collision that occurred on the bridge, shut the bridge down, and I don't remember how many patients exactly, but it was, again, several, 50 plus probably. Yeah, thanks, Susan. Anyway, a ton, and this would overwhelm our system fairly quickly, or at least push it. So in light of all of the events that I've talked about and the drill that Ed discussed, the biggest issue that kind of popped up it's twofold, I would say. One is identification of an MCI or potential MCI and getting DMCC up and running so that they're able to deal with the issue. And then secondarily, because of maybe that lag in identification, or because we're potentially busy, responders are busy, the people involved are busy, they forget maybe we should notify the DMCC and get them up and running. So how do we mitigate that in the short term so that once we recognize we have an issue, we can make that notification, but what do we do in the meantime? And basically, as the hub, if you will, for fire communications in Spokane County at least, it was identified that, hey, maybe our folks, the fire communication specialists, would be the most well-equipped folks to look at it from an initial standpoint, looking at sheer numbers of patients and capacity of each of the EDs for the local hospitals, and then say, okay, where can we send these patients based on severity to ensure that they get treatment in a timely fashion. And while we're making that sort, we can call the DMCC, get them up and running, and they can start worrying about some of the bigger picture things that they have to do to ensure an efficient, safe flow of patients. So our proposal at this point is that in Spokane County, again, we're talking regionally overall in the big picture of a lot of things, but this plan really only affects Spokane County for right now. We'll evaluate its efficacy, and then we can look to potentially branching out later and spreading it out regionally if there's a call for it and it seems to be working. But essentially, in Spokane County, the activations will be initiated by the Spokane Fire Department's Combined Communications Center, and we'll deal with that initial movement of patients from the scene, from whatever that scene is, to each of the different EDs in Spokane County. By doing this, this will allow for immediate patient placement into an ED from the scene, and then it's going to allow the DMCC to focus on some of the bigger picture issues that are going to probably arise as they start dealing with an influx of patients into the emergency department. So how do we do that from the standpoint of CCC? Because we're pre-hospital, we're not dealing with patients in hospital. So how can we do this effectively? So essentially the work group that's been tasked with trying to develop the process or plan sat down and with some work by, I can't think of Dean's last name, I'm drawing a blank, Dean Davis. he reached out to each of the EDs and said, okay, worst case scenario, regardless of what's happening in your emergency department, if we have an MCI, how many patients of varying severity from the standpoint of injury can you handle at any one time, any time of day? And so we now have this matrix to work from that says for each of these different hospitals in Spokane County, we know how many patients of each severity type they can receive without impacting their level of service or overwhelming them from the standpoint of services and capacity, et cetera. So Deaconess, they can take up to 4 red patients. These are the folks that need the highest level of treatment immediately, life-threatening, et cetera. Yellow patients, they're the folks that are basically kind of on the cusp. They have some potentially life-threatening injuries, but so far they're stable enough that they don't need super critical care. So essentially the green patients are the walking wounded. They have some sort of minor injury, but nothing of significant criticality that they can get some treatment whenever somebody has the time to get to them, essentially. So from that perspective, we have this matrix now for each of the hospitals that says how many reds they can take, how many yellows, and you can see in the matrix here that there isn't a number present for greens, and that's because everybody said, hey, a green can sit there and they can wait, and we're okay with that, and we can manage that. So based on this, the folks at the CCC, when we get an MCI of any kind that pops up, they can pull this matrix out. They can look at the incident and proximity of the incident to the various hospitals, looking at the numbers that they can take based on the severity of injury for the patient, and start letting the ambulances know this is where you can transport. And we won't get into the nitty-gritty about the level of injuries necessarily or anything other than are they a red, yellow, or green. And if we find out we have 4 red patients and it's something that's occurring on the freeway downtown, then we'll probably share the wealth and we'll send 2 reds to Deaconess and 2 to Sacred Heart. That'll be kind of the methodology to share the wealth so we don't overwhelm a single ED and ensure that the patients get the best level of care possible. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question from the floor is whether or not this is based on start, jump, start criteria, and yes, it is. Anything else before I keep talking fast? Yes, sir. Basically, at this point, I don't know if it was that Dean hadn't received numbers back from them or we're not going to consider them in the pool right now. I think that might be the case, but Ed's got some answers to that.
Yeah, I think that what we're looking at here is if you're looking at an emergency situation, that the Deaconess Emergency North and the VA are probably not equipped to take red and yellow patients. They may be able to stabilize, but then they're going to have to transport. And since we're trying to alleviate transports, we're not going to send them red or yellows unless we absolutely have to. We're also looking at other regional hospitals that can become part of this. Kootenai is just across the border. We've got other hospitals, so we'll expand that out, as Jay said. But that's the reason you see the black for the Emergency Room North and the VA.
No, yeah. So where do we go from here? You saw the matrix, and essentially it's a work in progress at this point. We have the draft plan in place. We're going to circulate that out amongst the folks that are part of the initial work group that helped develop the plan and the concept. And basically, we're going to end up looking for input. That's one of the reasons we're presenting in this forum today, is so that if anybody has input or concern, question, et cetera, that can be brought back to the group, and we can include or consider those issues while we're developing this further. We're hoping to have the plan finalized by the end of January of this next year. And then once it's finalized, figure out a point where we can actually exercise the plan, utilize all of my folks at the CCC and put it into action to see how well it works and try to shoot holes in it, because, you know, the last thing we want to do is find some sort of problem, I guess, when we actually need to utilize this plan and put it in place. So that's going to be the process over the next few months. And I think our initial plan when we said spring, we're looking hopefully no later than the end of Q1 of 2017 to actually test it out. So this is the contact info for myself and for Ed, and I didn't get his permission to use his contact info, but I used it anyway. So feel free to email him or myself or give us a call, and if you do have any questions, and then I would field any questions from the group now as well. So those are the super secret direct numbers to the person that's going to be the most effective at dealing with the patient movement stuff. So it could be the charge. In some cases, it might be somebody else, but it's whoever's got basically the phone on the hip. Yeah, we want the phone number that's going to provide the quickest route in to be able to get this information out there, or make the notifications, if you will.